It's pretty amazing that we lived through a pandemic. Large parts of it, we kind of zombie walked without knowing what we were doing, and now it's a part of our life in many ways. So it's a part of the IPCC scenarios as well. So let's read some points from this paper on scenarios and COVID-19. Global shocks such as pandemics, technological breakthroughs, economic crises, and other natural or human-made disruption, so-called wild cards, are irregular but expected features of socioeconomic development and therefore of scenarios. Obviously, this happened just before the big invasion of Ukraine by Russia happened, which has perturbed the energy markets, food markets, fertilizer markets, wheat market, and so on, which will probably be discussed in this context again in some other paper later on. Some scenarios explicitly introduce such features, while in others, including the SSP-RCP framework, there are implicit possibilities within the narratives that sketch broader changes in society without specifying causal events. So one of the pathways actually says regional conflicts. Is the Russian invasion of Ukraine a regional conflict? Even if it is, how does it cascade into the global market and affect global actions? For example, the Europeans were affected in terms of their gas supply from Russia, which affected how they were trying to deal with the winter, with maybe increasing the use of coal and natural gas, which are obviously not good, but also they to some extent ramped up the investment in renewables because they realize they cannot rely on energy markets getting kicked around this way. The implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for the SSPs will depend on which of these three possible types of consequences it has on societies worldwide. So this was written before the pandemic played out, and now we are hopefully completely out of it. That's what the WHO has declared, but China is still having some ups and downs. First, it may have primary short-term impacts with a V-shaped recovery. So there's a crash, let's say, and then a recovery. So that's a V-shaped recovery, at least at a global aggregate level. But some people's lives got changed permanently, and some businesses went out of business. For example, if reductions in emissions in the first several months of the pandemic fade over the following months, global carbon dioxide emissions in 2020 would decline only 4 to 7% from the previous year, with little long-term effect on global surface temperature. The Great Recession of 2008 had a similarly temporary effect on global emissions. By now in 2023, as I'm recording in June of 2023, basically at the end of, actually I'm in July, this is already July 4th, the recovery of the emissions has happened. So in fact there was around 7% dip in emissions, but we are now back and accelerating again. The Great Recession of 2008 had a similarly temporary effect on global emissions. Viewed on a century time scales, even such potentially transformational wildcard events as the breakup of the Soviet Union and its associated geopolitical alignment had only a transitory impact on global economic growth. I have to look at my watch because I'm expecting at my phone because I'm expecting a delivery. So let's read out this as the last piece of this paper on the usefulness, relevance, and applications of RCPs, SSPs, and the recommendations that we already read. The second possibility is that the indirect effect of the pandemic have long-term consequences that positively or negatively modify the current development path but do not fundamentally change it. This is how it seems to be playing out now. If the new development trajectory remains within the wide range of pathways already captured by the SSPs, modifications to the framework will not be necessary. For example, the pandemic could lead to a persistent reduction in economic growth rates, an L-shaped recovery, so you crash and then you don't come back up, exacerbate inequalities and increase societal and political conflict. The very different responses by countries around the world could accelerate global power shifts and deepen inequalities across countries. We still don't know, in terms of the COVID impacts, how the shifts have taken place in terms of longer term impacts, even though we are still recovering from COVID. Travel has picked up. Pretty much everything seems to be back to normal. Such consequences would move the world towards SSP4, characterized by a small number of globally connected elites with access to basic services and increasing number of poor and marginalized people who struggle with hunger and unemployment. Alternatively, the pandemic could trigger investments in health and education, lead to efforts to reduce inequality, increase investments in fair digitalization, reduce travel and use of fossil fuels, and reduce environmental impacts. Consequences like these could shift the development pathway towards SSP1. Well, it's not exactly playing out yet in any of these grand scales, but all the data is not in, and we still don't know where we'll end up in 5 years after the perturbation has just ended in 2022, let's say. A third possibility is that COVID-19 contributes to the crossing of a tipping point in human and natural systems, shifting development pathways to a fundamentally new trajectory. There were, in fact, many incidences of lockdowns and people being out of the way, changing behavior of many species, birds, wild animals of various kinds, and other species, invading or exploring new places where humans had made it impossible for them to wander into. And humans are now back everywhere with the big force. The rebound travel seems to be here. There are some unexpected delays. Let's say US passport system is apparently struggling, so many of the Americans this summer are not able to travel because passport processing is taking much longer. So this will work through the system. So we will see many papers coming out in terms of the impacts on various aspects of human existence globally and locally because of COVID. Right? So third possibility is that COVID-19 contributes to the crossing of a tipping point in human and natural systems, which doesn't seem to have happened, shifting development pathways to a fundamentally new trajectory. This idea of telecommuting or working from home may have had some fundamental shifts in terms of employers wanting the employees to come back and some people not wanting to go back and resigning, changing jobs or not working anymore, etc. But this may also be a temporary shift. The inequalities highlighted by the pandemic may be a route to such transformational change. Societal resistance, whether peaceful or violent, has been common during periods with high levels of inequalities. You can see examples in this paper. Societal conflicts were the starting point of most great transformations. Structural changes resulted in new policies and programs to increase societal equity and improve developmental pathways. So civil rights movements and so on come to mind. Second World War transformed the geopolitical alignments, industrial productions, imports, exports, and business models and so on. In this way, disruptions can lead to discontinuities in development pathways. Whether such an outcome would require changes to the SSP framework is less clear, because even some transformational changes might remain within the very wide range of challenges to mitigation and adaptation spanned by the SSPs. But what's missing in this discussion is how climate action, which is already suffering from this disconnect between talk, decisions and actions, actually got disrupted by COVID-19 and the recovery stimulus funds, etc., that we talked about before and elsewhere in other courses, did not really favor climate action, green technology, etc. It was just geared towards reviving economies, consumer confidence, consumer spending, churning the economic machine, etc. So how will climate action sustain perturbations like the pandemic, the Russian invasion, or whatever else may come next. That's not so clear in terms of the SSP framework. Okay, so there was whether such an outcome would require changes to SSP framework is less clear, because even some transformational changes might remain within the very wide range of challenges to mitigation and adaptation spanned by the SSPs. So this is just saying, okay, SSPs are good enough because they can handle such perturbations and they are covered, but one has to wait and see. A broader research program could explore the SSP space beyond the current narratives by, for example, identifying weak signals of currently niche phenomena that could dominate in an alternative future. Also, it's not unclear how impacts of COVID-19, for example, have local shifts that add up to global changes, which don't exactly follow the SSP pathways but end up going in a different way, or don't fit within the phase space what if scenarios spanned by the SSP 1 to 5 future, right? So we have to worry about those. A recent SSP-based stakeholder exercise held after the start of the pandemic illustrates the framework's continuing relevance. In May 2020, stakeholders from academia, policy, practice, and business downscaled and enriched versions of the SSP for the UK and its countries. The SSP framework was deemed sufficiently flexible to enable participants to frame the issues that COVID-19 raised. For instance, one key element considered was response to global shocks, framed between the extremes of persistence and transformative change, while the second element was health, framed in terms of low versus high investment. Stakeholders included COVID-19 related concerns into the development of the UK shared socioeconomic pathways. The SSP-RCP framework continues to be relevant and is consistent with wildcard events, but monitoring the consequences of COVID-19 and ensuring that scenarios continue to be flexible to account for future shocks will be important for deciding if and when revisions are necessary. So maybe such a paper will again come about to include the perturbation because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the more direct economic consequences and energy consequences and agriculture consequences that it has had, and it's not over yet. It's still playing out, and it's still possible something really stupid will be done by one of the sides. You know which side is more likely to do something nasty. So how this will end up playing out is not clear, because the Syrian war, which played out and is still not completely finished, did not affect the world markets the way Russian invasion has affected, because Russia controlled energy markets. Ukraine had impact on wheat and fertilizers, and direct impacts on Russia and global energy markets, Norway supplying gas and US supplying gas to Europe to make up for the disruption to Russian supply, or Russian stopping the supply, and so on. China and India have played their own role in terms of buying oil and gas from Russia. So all these things are still playing out, and we don't know how the scenario framework will look in terms of covering this aspect of these perturbations. And in the meantime, we still have emissions increasing. And what are the impacts on SDGs? What are the impacts on the 2030 targets in terms of where we need to be to reach the global warming targets in terms of the timeline at the emissions reductions by 2030, 2050, net zero, and so on? It's still not clear. So let's hope that SSPs cover these eventualities as they are playing out, but also that the reliance on the technological promises such as carbon capture and sequestration and bioenergy are not separately affected by these kind of geopolitical perturbations, because we still don't know that, right? So how the food demand and food supply change because of these wars is anything but clear, so we have to wait and see. Okay, so this concludes this paper's coverage of the applications of achievements of SSPs, RCPs, and recommendations to improve them and make them more relevant, usable, and so on. Okay.